Welcome back to the channel, you guys. It is Comic Kid here again, and we are back with another Run v Run segment here for you today. Now, if you clicked on the video, you obviously know we are discussing the lesser appreciated Grayson run by Tim Seeley and Tom King, as well as the Ric Grayson run, which took place in Nightwing, but specifically within the parameters of Scott Lobdell and Dan Jurgens' time on the character. Now, I know these are not exactly the most popular stories for Dick Grayson out there, but both of them are fairly close to each other, like surprisingly close to each other, and very similar in like concept, and they're very, very weird. But as the two kind of like random eras of Nightwing, I did think it would be fun to discuss these two here today. And if y'all want me to discuss the New 52 run with Kyle Higgins, as well as like the Tim Seeley Rebirth run, I can totally do that as well. Just let me know down in the comments section below if y'all would be interested in that. But for now, we're just going to focus on Grayson and the Ric Grayson stuff. Now, a little bit of background on Grayson, just because it came first. This one came at a time following the Forever Evil storyline, where Dick Grayson was unmasked and his identity was revealed to the world by the crime syndicate. And I do have my issues with the Forever Evil storyline, but essentially this was the lead-in for the Grayson run. Essentially, after his identity is revealed, Dick Grayson goes into hiding with Spiral, and he's given an all-new identity, becomes Agent 37, and is no longer a member of the Bat family, technically. Now, you do find out pretty early on that Batman has actually sent Dick Grayson as like an undercover agent of his own to infiltrate Spiral and report back, and so you do kind of have this intelligence slash counterintelligence super spy story, which is the basis for Grayson as the plot unfolds. Now, throughout the run, a few other characters are introduced. Some are like reintroduced from before New 52, most notably with Helena Bertinelli. Now, for many people, she is the more popular version of Huntress out there. She's my personal favorite just because I like the canon version a little bit more than just Helena Wayne. I still love Helena Wayne, but Bertinelli just feels a bit more right within the DC universe in my opinion. And so it's actually great to see this all-new version of Helena Bertinelli in the New 52. That said, I also think they made her a total badass. She eventually becomes the head of Spiral, and there's a lot of like back and forth between her and Dick as well, which, by the way, I will be saying Dick a lot throughout this episode, and so be mature. But aside from that, Helena's relationship with Dick is, I guess, like a positive point in the story. The two have had some like tension in the comics over the years as well, and so it's very nice to not only see Helena Bertinelli again, but a kind of unique spin and a, I guess, welcome one on her relationship with Dick as well. Now, one of the other more notable characters throughout this arc is Tiger. Like Dick Grayson, Tiger was given an agent number, and he was actually number 1 just because he was the best agent with Spiral at the time. And so, with Dick being the newest one and Tiger being one of the oldest, more experienced agents, it did create a kind of fun, unique buddy cop-like dynamic between the two of them. Obviously, there were tensions, they didn't like each other, you have like some very over-masculine conflict between them that's just kind of like poking fun at some like tropes within the buddy cop genre or super spy genre, whatever you want to call it. But I do think by the end of the series, Tiger was actually a far more intriguing character than he initially starts out as. And even since Grayson's conclusion, we have seen Tiger pop up from time to time in the main Nightwing run. But regardless, the series really succeeds in making like a super spy type of epic story. Now, the series did run only 20 issues with like, I believe, 3 annuals in there, and so it's not like the longest story, and by the end, I don't think Tom King or Tim Seeley actually wrote like the last 2 or 3 issues, but that was especially when they were setting up for Rebirth. And so the series does kind of come to a proper conclusion a few issues before its real conclusion. But all in all, for like the 17 or 18 issues that it is mostly comprised of, I do think it's a very good spy story within what they had planned. Now, obviously, I do prefer Dick as Nightwing, and I was a little upset that they were just like, no Nightwing book. Dan DiDio was still in charge at this time, and we all kind of know that he has kind of like a mega hatred for Dick Grayson. And so it's a little disappointing to see Dick kind of take a back seat within the larger universe, but I do still think they tied him into the DC universe very well and still paid like a respect to the character. And for only being 17 or 18 issues in the actual like proper run, I do think it's a very good story given what they were told to work with, if that makes sense. Now, generally, when there's two authors as well, you get kind of some like creative flow disruption, I guess you would say. Like, one author's voice tends to dominate the other, but I feel like Seeley and King both worked very, very well throughout this whole run. I was very impressed by how seamless their writing styles could be, and as much as I do enjoy Tom King, Seeley's generally a little hit or miss for me, and so I don't know if it was just the King influence countering the Seeley-ness or whatever, but I actually thought this and Seeley's Rebirth Nightwing were both phenomenal. So all in all, I generally do say that Grayson is a good story. It is definitely not the best Nightwing story, but if people wanted to read it, I would definitely recommend it. There's also plenty of little moments in this story that are just so clever, like especially towards the end when Nightwing visits all the members of the Bat family and like Bruce is gone, Tim and Jason are together, and he talks to Damian and Batgirl separately, and he does his like sentence thing that spells out break it, and I just thought that was incredibly brilliant and probably incredibly difficult to pull off as well. And so I am not sure which author's idea that was, but I loved it. And so there are some really great moments in this story as well. Now, to focus on the art, Miko Janin did most of the art for Grayson. There were a few interlude issues where he like only did half or there was a guest artist, but for the most part, Janin was the dominant artist on Grayson, and I mean, his stuff is absolutely fantastic. I honestly think he's one of the best artists currently working in the business, and seeing his version of Dick was like phenomenal. There's a particular moment where Dick suits up, and it's just so perfect. It's a little later in the series, but they go to a party and Dick's in the suit, and it is just chef's kiss, like perfect art. And so, yeah, all in all, I do feel like Grayson, like I mentioned before, is a strong Dick Grayson story. It's just not Nightwing, which is where everyone wants him to be. And then, as I mentioned earlier as well, it did tie him into the larger DC universe still. Lex Luthor is aware of Dick Grayson's situation, and they kind of have an arc or so there. And I do kind of wish it had paid off a little bit more in the aftermath, like with the school of female assassins that Helena Bertinelli is kind of training. I kind of wanted to see a little bit more of them, either throughout the run or maybe after the fact. But that arc kind of dropped off from what I had read and noticed, and so I do feel like there were some threads that could have been expanded on, but I mean, what you gonna do? They got him back to Nightwing, and that was like the most important thing. So, and yes, I do know that they touch on this a little later in the Seeley Rebirth run, and that kind of wraps up some of those threads as well, but it still would have been nice to have seen some like greater development at the same time. But that is about everything that I have to say about Grayson. Moving on into the Rebirth Ric Grayson era, this came kind of out of nowhere. Ben Percy was on the book right before this event happened, but essentially in the main Batman run, which was by Tom King, which King has said that he was instructed to include this story, but Bane has KG Beast orchestrate this whole plot to shoot Dick Grayson in the head, and rather than like kill him or anything, he suffers amnesia, has no memory of who he is or who Batman is or his time as Nightwing or anything, and he decides to become Ric Grayson as he sets up his new life in Bloodhaven and so on and so forth. But of course, it's kind of like a Jason Bourne type thing where the muscle memory is still there and his like drive to do good is still there, and you get a whole bunch of other like Nightwings. And this is definitely, right off the bat, I'll go ahead and say it, this is definitely my least favorite of the two stories. And so yeah, I thought it was just very strange. Ben Percy did say that he was booted off the title because he did not like the Ric Grayson direction. Tom King had said that he was instructed to include this story, and I guess Scott Lobdell was the only one who was game to write it. Now, this also came at a time where in Rebirth, Nightwing had just gone back to being like monthly after being a bi-monthly release, and it was only like mid 30s or maybe early 40s in its issue run in, so we hadn't really even had Nightwing himself back for that long before Dan DiDio decided to overhaul his whole life again. And I don't know if it's just that Grayson itself was just like a better story overall, or if it was like a timing thing, but I feel like most people would agree that the Ric Grayson storyline is inferior to the Grayson arc. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to hate on like Scott Lobdell or Dan Jurgens in this case, but this was definitely a time when Nightwing fans were having it rough, and so the story itself was just also not enough to make it redeemable in the eyes of like Nightwing fans as well. Now, we will get the positives out of the way for the Ric Grayson era, mostly because I feel like there are far fewer with them. And so one of the things that I did like was I actually think seeing like firemen and policemen take on the Nightwing mantle was a unique idea and offered a broader perspective. That said, this came right before a bunch of stuff started happening in real world events, and it did kind of seem like it was a little a problematic side, and so I don't know if that's the intent that Scott Lobdell was going for, but it definitely didn't quite seem to fit the vibe that reflected the current real world. That said, I think a lot of these newer characters and the people who took on the mantle of Nightwing didn't really seem all that interesting much either. And throughout the arc, they kept trying to develop them, but again, it just always felt off and I could never really care about them. And so that was, certainly a problem. I feel like Lobdell tried to grapple with like different philosophies for like justice in here and like different approaches to justice, and I just feel like it's been done before and the characters themselves weren't interesting and it just didn't really hold my attention, and I've probably forgotten so much of this arc. I just kind of tried to power through it just because I knew eventually they were going to bring Dick Grayson back, but yeah. But circling back to positives for this story, it was also kind of nice to see the Bat family without Dick Grayson in this aspect, because while Batman always knew Dick was alive in Grayson, in this they have actually lost Dick, and he is not himself, and a bunch of other key moments are happening to other Bat family members in this, particularly the death of Alfred, and so because Dick was not around for the family for the death of Alfred, it really kind of shined a light on his importance to not only the family, but then the rest of the DC universe. And so I do feel like his absence in this era was notably more significant than in Grayson, if that makes sense. Now, also unlike Grayson, while Tom King and Tim Seeley wrote that story together at the same time, Dan Jurgens followed up on what Scott Lobdell had already established. And I remember when Dan Jurgens was announced as the new Nightwing writer, a lot of people expected him to kind of re-establish Dick Grayson, and then he did like an arc or two where he just kind of continued the storyline, And eventually he did get around to bringing Nightwing back, but up until that point, as much as I do love Dan Jurgens, I felt like his Ric Grayson run was still fairly lackluster. Again, I absolutely love Dan Jurgens, he's actually one of my favorite comic authors. I was just a little let down by his Nightwing run. That said, I do think he brought him back in a pretty solid way. He re-established the character in a good way, while kind of giving him a blank slate also. And I think Tom Taylor, who's now the current Nightwing author, took the baton from Jurgens perfectly and just ran with it. And so I do applaud Dan for managing to bring everything full circle once again for Dick Grayson. So now to get into some of the bigger negatives for this story, I mean, I feel like I've kind of already touched on like the biggest disappointments. Like, it's so weird to see a Dick Grayson who's not Dick Grayson at all, and it's weird to have Nightwings who are just kind of cheap knockoffs and uninteresting, and that's really the biggest negatives. In terms of art, I do think that Michael Janin is a significantly stronger artist than Travis Moore and Pat Zurcher, who were the like main artists on this. They did have a few other guest artists throughout this time period as well. And so yeah, all in all, the Ric Grayson era is just so much weaker in my opinion that it's so skippable. And I really hate to discredit the efforts of the teams that worked on this book, but this was certainly not the approach that Nightwing fans wanted to go for. And so, yeah, but that is about everything that I have to say about these two runs. If it was not already obvious, I definitely preferred Grayson over Ric Grayson, and I just think Tom King and Tim Seeley still managed to make a good story out of a bad situation, whereas the Ric Grayson era really just kind of fell apart and did almost nothing. But as always, guys, let me know what you think of these two storylines down in the comments section below, and let me know what other runs you might want to see go up against each other. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe as well, and I will be seeing you guys again real soon.